I heard the engine before I saw it. Heavy, diesel loud, too close. I ran out the back door, still holding my coffee, and stopped dead. The blade was already moving through my marsh, black peat curling up behind the tracks. A great blue heron lifted off the cattails and cleared the tree line. 15 years, that bird had hunted that wetland. Gone in 30 seconds. I'm standing there, boots in the mud, when I hear a car door. Loretta Vance, HOA president, white Lexus, 7:30 in the morning. She looked at the dozer, looked at me and said,
"We're building the connectivity path today, Garrett. Move."
Loretta, this is federally protected wetland. You need an Army Corps permit.
We don't need a permit. We need you to move.
That was her first mistake. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from? Because if you own property with a natural buffer, you need to hear what happens next. Let me back up. My name is Garrett Winslow, 53 years old, retired civil engineer, 30 years designing stormwater systems for municipalities across North Carolina, retention ponds, drainage corridors, flood mitigation. I know what water does when you try to control it. More importantly, I know what happens when you don't. 15 years ago, I bought a 5-acre parcel at the far edge of Pinecrest Landing, a planned community outside Raleigh. Most people looked at the lot and saw a problem. Too much wetland, too little buildable space. I looked at it and saw exactly what I wanted. Along the southwestern edge ran 1.8 acres of jurisdictional wetland, federally recognized under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, delineated by a licensed environmental consultant, documented with the Army Corps of Engineers. Palestrine emergent wetland, soft rush, common cattail, blue flag iris. Hydric soils going down 4 feet. I built a cedar chip walking path along the edge. Wooden steps down to the water. My grandkids named the heron Gerald. It was, as my wife used to say, the best part of the property. Now, Pinecrest Landing's HOA, 5-person board. Reasonable people, mostly, until about 3 years ago when Loretta Vance ran for president on a platform of, and I'm not making this up, restoring community standards. She won by 11 votes. Loretta is 61 years old, former real estate agent. She has a laminated HOA lanyard that she wears to community meetings, grocery runs, and, apparently, illegal wetland destruction. The woman has laminated her meeting agendas. That tells you everything. Her first act as president, a community-wide violation notice cracking down on unapproved vegetative growth over 18 inches. She sent one to a retired botanist 3 doors down for his ornamental prairie grass. He framed it. The HOA newsletter arrived every month on goldenrod yellow paper, smelling faintly of toner and self-importance. It was always exactly 2 pages. 1 page of community updates, 1 page of Loretta. 6 months before the dozer showed up, Loretta proposed the connectivity path, a paved golf cart width shortcut from the clubhouse parking lot to the far end of the amenity corridor. Convenient, popular with the golf cart crowd, and, by pure coincidence, routed directly across the southwestern corner of my wetland buffer. She presented this at a board meeting I wasn't invited to. No environmental review, no engineering assessment, no mention of the Army Corps delineation I had filed with the HOA office 8 months earlier. What I got instead was a certified letter, not a request, not a conversation, a notice of construction easement, informing me that work would begin within 30 days pursuant to the board's authority under Article 7 of the CC&Rs. I wrote back, 2 paragraphs, calm, precise, cited Section 404, attached the delineation report, requested a halt pending jurisdictional review, hand-delivered it to the HOA office on a Wednesday afternoon. Loretta was at the front desk. She read the first paragraph, looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "Oh, Garrett, sweetie, this is a community path, not a dredge and fill operation. We're not building a port." Her assistant laughed, the nervous kind of laugh that means, "Please don't make this worse." I didn't laugh. I thanked her for her time, walked back out across the faux marble tile, got in my truck, and sat in the parking lot for about 4 minutes. 30 years of engineering teaches you one thing above everything else. Systems fail in predictable ways. You just have to know where to look. I knew exactly where to look. I went home and pulled out my copy of 33 USC Section 1344, and I started making calls. That was a Friday. The dozer arrived the following Tuesday, while I was at the dentist. I want to be clear about the timing here, not because it matters legally, but because it says everything about Loretta's strategy. She waited for a weekday morning. She had Vance and Sons on site by 7 a.m. By the time I pulled back into my driveway at 9:15 with a clean bill of dental health and a mild lecture about flossing, the work was essentially done. 180 feet of compacted gravel and disturbed soil, cutting straight through what the Army Corps had classified as Palestrine emergent wetland. The cedar path was gone. The wooden steps were in a pile at the edge of the site. The operator was loading equipment onto the trailer. I stood at the property line for a long moment. Civil engineers are trained to observe before they react, so I observed. The fill material, crushed gravel over what appeared to be a compacted clay base, sat directly on top of wetland peat. I could see the peat exposed at the cut edges. Dark, spongy, fibrous. The kind of substrate that has been saturated for decades. The kind of substrate that does not behave like mineral soil under load. Loretta had just built a path on top of a sponge. I went inside and made a list. Here's what most people don't know about wetland fill, and this is important, so stay with me. Under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, any discharge of dredged or fill material into jurisdictional wetlands requires a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. Full stop. There is no HOA bylaw, no CC&R provision, no community vote that overrides federal jurisdiction. The permit process exists precisely to prevent exactly what Loretta had just done. Someone with local authority making a unilateral decision about land that falls under federal protection. Takeaway. If your property contains jurisdictional wetlands, no one, not your HOA, not your city council, can legally fill them without a federal permit. That protection exists regardless of who owns the surrounding land. I photographed everything. GPS, stamped, systematic. I walked the entire length of the fill, narrating into my phone against the delineation report. This area, classified as wetland, now covered. This swale, marked on the survey, now graded flat. This section, noted as seasonal ponding zone, now compacted gravel. Then I called my old contact at the Raleigh district of the Army Corps of Engineers, a woman I'd worked with on a municipal drainage project back in 2009. She was sympathetic and efficient. She gave me the name of the Regulatory Division's complaint intake coordinator and told me exactly what language to use. That evening I filed 3 complaints. Army Corps Regulatory Division, NC Division of Water Resources, and the one that would make Loretta's phone ring at 7 a.m. 2 days later, an EPA Region 4 wetland enforcement tip. The EPA tip line is public. Anyone can use it. You describe the location, the nature of the fill, the date, and whether jurisdictional determination documentation exists. I had all of it, filed in 20 minutes. Then I called my neighbor, Brenda Calloway. Brenda is 64 years old, retired school teacher, and has lived at Pinecrest Landing for 19 years. She is also, quietly, the most organized person I have ever met. She maintains a color-coded spreadsheet of every HOA violation notice issued in the past 3 years, cross-referenced by property location and board decision date. She started it as a hobby. It became something else entirely. I told Brenda what happened. She was quiet for a moment. "Garrett," she said, "I've been waiting for something like this." Within 48 hours, 18 residents had received Brenda's group text. It included 2 of my photos, a 1-paragraph plain English explanation of Section 404, and the question, "Does anyone know if this is legal?" My reply, at 9:14 p.m. No. The thread ran to 67 messages by midnight. Most of them were variations of outrage. A few were people asking genuinely useful questions. One was Phil Osterhaus, retired HVAC contractor, 22 years in the community, board member, who wrote simply, "I didn't vote for this." 4 words. But in the context of an HOA governance dispute, those 4 words are the crack in the foundation. I screenshot it, added it to my file. The file was getting thick. Loretta moved fast. I'll give her that. 4 days after the fill, she called an emergency board meeting. The agenda, goldenrod paper, hand-delivered to every door on the street, described the connectivity path as approved Phase 1 community amenity infrastructure. There was no vote record, because there had been no vote. What there had been was a provision buried in Article 7 of the HOA's CC&Rs, an emergency maintenance clause allowing the board president to authorize expenditures up to $15,000 without full board approval. Fast decisions, leaky roofs, that kind of thing. Reasonable on paper. The Vance and Sons invoice for the connectivity path was $14,800. I want you to sit with that number for a second. The threshold was $15,000. The invoice was $14,800. Written that way on purpose by a contractor who happened to share a last name with the board president. That contractor was Wayne Vance, Loretta's brother-in-law. At the emergency meeting, Loretta presented what she called an environmental clearance letter. One page, printed on a landscape architect's letterhead, stating that the project area does not appear to constitute regulated wetlands based on a visual site inspection. The landscape architect was licensed in landscape design, not environmental science, not hydrology, not engineering. Her site visit had lasted 35 minutes on a dry afternoon in September, 6 weeks before the fill. She had not reviewed the Army Corps delineation. She had, apparently, not looked at the soil. Loretta distributed this letter as evidence of due diligence. She did not distribute my delineation report, the one she had received, signed for, and filed 8 months earlier. Then came the letter to me, formal, measured, 2 paragraphs on HOA letterhead. The path was completed under board authority. The area would remain in use as a community amenity. And, this is the part that made Clifton Marsh laugh out loud when I showed it to him later, if I continued to file regulatory complaints, the board would be compelled to review my property's compliance status. In plain English, nice yard you have there. Be a shame if someone started issuing violations. Here's something worth knowing. Under North Carolina General Statute 47F-3-118, HOA boards are required to maintain financial records and make them available to members upon written request. Most HOA members don't know this exists. Most boards count on that. Takeaway. In most states, you have a statutory right to your HOA's financial records. Submit the request in writing, cite the relevant statute, and they are legally required to comply. I submitted my request the same week. 3 years of invoices, all board minutes referencing the connectivity path, any environmental documentation. I sent it certified mail with return receipt. Meanwhile, I called Clifton Marsh, environmental attorney, Raleigh, 15 years handling Clean Water Act cases. I had been referred to him twice over the years and never needed him. I needed him now. We met for an hour. I brought the delineation report, the EPA complaint confirmation, Loretta's clearance letter, and the threatening letter about my compliance status. Clifton read everything without speaking. Then he leaned back and said, "Son, they didn't just step on a rake. They handed the rake to the federal government and asked them to hold it." I liked him immediately. He agreed to take the case on a consultation basis pending the regulatory response. No lawsuit yet. No need. The federal agencies were already moving. What neither Loretta nor I fully appreciated yet was that a third party had also entered the situation. Nature. 3 weeks after the fill, it rained. Not dramatically, just 2 days of steady October rain, the kind that soaks in slowly and goes deep. The connectivity path, built on wetland peat, began to sink. Compacted gravel over saturated peat doesn't behave like a road. The peat compresses, shifts, and pushes water laterally into any adjacent fill zone. Within 10 days, standing water pooling along both edges, soft spots developing in the center, gravel migrating into the surrounding muck. Loretta sent Vance and Sons back to add more gravel. The additional weight accelerated the subsidence. I watched this from my porch with a cup of coffee. It was, professionally speaking, completely predictable. Fill material over hydric soil under hydraulic load behaves exactly one way. It sinks. I didn't say anything publicly. I just watched and photographed and added everything to the file. The file was now a binder. By November, the path had dropped 4 inches on average. The low point, a section near the midpoint where the peat was deepest, had subsided almost 8 inches. It held standing water continuously, not puddles after rain. Standing water always. the kind of water that reflects the sky back at you on a clear morning and reminds you that you are, in fact, standing in a wetland. Loretta called it a drainage issue. She sent a letter to the community explaining that minor settling was being addressed and that the path remains safe for use. She did not mention that the settling was structural, ongoing, and, from an engineering standpoint, not fixable without removing the fill entirely. You cannot solve a wetland hydrology problem with more gravel. This is not an opinion, it is physics. At the November board meeting, Loretta proposed a solution, a French drain along the path's edge to manage adjacent property runoff. The implication being that my property, my wetland, the one that had existed for 60 years before Loretta discovered golf cart convenience, was somehow responsible for the water. The estimated cost, $22,000, to be drawn from the community reserve account. Board member Phil Osterhaus raised his hand. Phil is not a dramatic man. He is the kind of man who shows up, does the work, and writes things down. 22 years in the community. He once spent 14 hours in a crawl space fixing a shared HVAC line rather than bill the neighbor for a contractor. He is not easily moved. "Loretta," he said, "did we get a federal permit for the original path?" The room went quiet. "We followed all applicable procedures," Loretta said. Phil wrote something in his notebook, underlined it from the sound of it. 2 rows back, Brenda Calloway was already typing. The following week, Walt Gunderson visited the site. Walt is a field inspector with the Raleigh district of the Army Corps of Engineers. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a soil auger, a field notebook, and the energy of a man who has seen a lot of unpermitted fill in his career, and is no longer surprised by any of it. He was on site for 2 hours. He took cores at 6 locations along the fill zone. He documented hydric soil indicators, the gray and mottled subsoil that only develops in areas with extended seasonal saturation. He measured the standing water depth at the midpoint depression. Then he stood at the edge of the path, looked at his core sample, looked at the standing water, and looked at me. "Yeah," he said, "this is wetland." He said it the way a doctor says, "Yeah, that's broken," while looking at an X-ray. Matter of fact, slightly tired, completely certain. His formal report would take 3 weeks to process, but I had heard what I needed to hear. That same afternoon, my records request came back. Not from Loretta, from the HOA's property management company. Apparently Loretta's assistant, a quiet woman named Deborah, had quietly complied without telling her employer. On a thumb drive, in a manila envelope, delivered to my mailbox without fanfare. I plugged it in that evening at my kitchen table. 3 years of invoices, board meeting minutes going back to Loretta's first term, internal email chains between the board president and the property management contact. I read for 2 hours, made notes, flagged documents. Then I found the email, dated 8 months before construction. Loretta to the property manager. "Wayne says he can do the whole path for under $15,000 if we keep it off the regular bid process. I'll run it as a maintenance item." I read it 3 times. Then I called Clifton Marsh. It was 7:30 in the evening. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting this call. I read him the email. There was a pause. "Forward that to me tonight," he said. "Don't send it to anyone else yet." "How bad is it?" I asked. "For her?" Another pause. "It's a confession, Garrett. It's a written confession." I closed the laptop, sat in the kitchen for a while. Outside, somewhere in the dark at the back of the property, a bullfrog hit still water with a low, resonant bap. The marsh was still there, battered, sinking Loretta's path from below, doing what wetlands do, waiting. The thumb drive had more on it than one email. Clifton spent 3 days going through everything I sent him. On Friday afternoon, he called me and asked me to come to his office, in person, bring the binder. I brought 2 binders by that point. Clifton's office is the kind of place that makes you feel like the right person ended up in the right profession. Bookshelves floor to ceiling. A framed copy of the Clean Water Act on the wall. Not decorative, annotated. He had printed the Vance & Sons invoices and laid them out on the conference table in chronological order. 3 years, he said. Landscaping, hardscape maintenance, drainage consultation, site preparation. $183,000. He let that land. Now look at this. He slid across a copy of the HOA's Reserve Fund study, a document every HOA is required to maintain, projecting repair and replacement costs over a multi-year horizon, and the reserves needed to cover them. Per their own study, the fund should have held approximately $340,000. Actual balance, $67,000. I did the math without being asked. The gap was $273,000. 3 years of Vance & Sons invoices totaled $183,000, and Clifton had flagged at least $47,000 of line items for work that, cross-referenced against meeting minutes and Phil Osterhaus's memory, had never visibly occurred. Drainage consultation on a section of the community that had no drainage work done. Hardscape maintenance on a parking area that Phil, who walks the property regularly, had not seen touched in 2 years. Site preparation for a project that was never built. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, Clifton said. This is a pattern. Here is what HOA members need to understand, and I mean really understand, not just nod at. HOA board members owe a fiduciary duty to the association. That means they are legally obligated to act in the best interest of the membership, not themselves, not their family members, not their preferred contractors. Self-dealing, awarding contracts to a related party without disclosure and competitive bidding, is a breach of that duty. In cases where funds have been misappropriated, it can cross from a civil matter into a criminal one. Takeaway. HOA financial misconduct isn't just an ethical violation. Breach of fiduciary duty can result in personal civil liability and, in serious cases, criminal prosecution. Clifton filed a formal complaint with the NC Secretary of State's office that week, attaching the email as Exhibit A and the invoice discrepancy analysis as Exhibit B. The Secretary of State oversees community association disputes in North Carolina. They have investigative authority. He also flagged something I had missed in the CC&Rs. Article 9, Section 4. Competitive bidding required on any project exceeding $10,000. The connectivity path invoice was $14,800. It fell squarely in the competitive bidding zone. Loretta had not just bypassed the vote requirement. She had violated her own association's governing documents. I drove home from Clifton's office on a clear November afternoon, the kind of day where the light goes golden at 4 o'clock, and everything looks more peaceful than it has any right to. I turned onto my street, pulled into the driveway, went around back. The path was still sinking. The water in the midpoint depression reflected the late sky, pale blue, streaked with cloud. A great blue heron stood at the edge of it. Gerald was back. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a well-built trap come together. Not a mean satisfaction, more like the feeling of a properly engineered system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Every component in its place, every load path accounted for. That's what the next 6 weeks felt like. Clifton filed the Secretary of State complaint on a Monday. On Tuesday, Brenda Calloway finished her resident impact document. 41 pages, color-coded, cross-referencing every HOA violation issued in the past 3 years against the Vance & Sons payment timeline. What it showed was a pattern Brenda had suspected for 2 years, but never had the financial data to confirm. Properties on the outer edges of the community, larger lots, less manicured, occupied by longer-term residents, received violations at 3 times the rate of newer, denser properties near the clubhouse. Selective enforcement, documented, dated, organized into tabs with color-coded flags. Brenda is a retired schoolteacher. Her spreadsheet would make a federal auditor weep with admiration. Phil Osterhaus reached out to the 2 other board members who had been kept in the dark, Craig Dempsey and Renata Fuqua. Both had assumed, reasonably, that Loretta was operating within her authority. Neither had known about the family relationship with Vance & Sons. Neither had seen the reserve fund balance. Craig's response, in Phil's telling, "She spent what?" Both signed written statements confirming they had never approved the connectivity path as a capital project and had not been informed of the contractor relationship. Those statements went into Binder 2. A contract attorney in the community reviewed the CC and RS pro bono and confirmed the Article 9 competitive bidding violation in writing. 3 residents with real estate backgrounds offered declarations attesting to the impact of the reserve fund shortfall on property values. One resident, a retired CPA named Howard, offered to conduct a preliminary financial review of the HOA's books. Howard's preliminary review took 10 days. His report used the word irregularities 9 times and 14 pages. Clifton hired him formally as an expert witness. Meanwhile, I contacted the NC Division of Water Resources and formally requested a cease and desist enforcement order against the HOA, requiring removal of the fill and restoration of the wetland to pre-disturbance conditions. The division, working in coordination with the Army Corps complaint, initiated a joint enforcement review. Both agencies were now formally engaged. And then I did something that required no legal expertise, no engineering knowledge, and no money whatsoever. I stopped mowing the buffer strip on my side of the property line. That's it. I just stopped maintaining the area around the path. I didn't touch Loretta's construction. I didn't divert water. I didn't plant anything. I simply stepped back and let the marsh do what marshes do when human beings stop aggressively preventing it. Within 2 weeks, cattail rhizomes were pushing up through the gravel edges. Rushes were re-establishing along the saturated margins. The standing water in the subsidence depression, now 10 inches deep at center, had attracted migrating waterfowl, wood ducks mostly. A pair took up residence in the pooled water along the path's midpoint. My grandkids named the male one Gerald Jr. The original Gerald, the heron, was hunting the edges daily. I photographed all of it, time-stamped, GPS tagged, organized by date. Then I called Tomas Elkin. Tomas covers the environmental beat for the Raleigh News and Observer. We had spoken once before, briefly, when I commented on a stormwater piece he was writing. He remembered me. When I explained what had happened, the unpermitted fill, the self-dealing, the sinking path, the federal enforcement review, the wood ducks, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Can I come see the path?" He came out on a Thursday afternoon, stood at the edge of the subsidence depression, watched Gerald Jr. paddle through what was supposed to be a community amenity, took notes. On his way out, he asked when the annual HOA meeting was scheduled. 6 weeks, I said. He wrote it in his notebook. Here is what I understood, as an engineer, about the situation I was building. The goal was not to ambush Loretta. The goal was to construct conditions where the truth was so visible, so physically present, so thoroughly documented, that no alternative narrative could survive contact with it. You don't win these things with a dramatic moment. You win them by making the facts undeniable before the dramatic moment arrives. The annual meeting was the moment. Everything else was load-bearing structure. I submitted my member agenda items: financial audit, conflict of interest disclosure, wetland remediation vote, and collected the 41 signatures required within 72 hours. The trap was set. Loretta felt the ground shifting. Maybe not in the wetland engineering sense, though that too, literally, daily, but politically. The board was fracturing. The residents were talking. The federal agencies were not going away. So she did what cornered people do. She swung. First came the community letter. Goldenrod paper, as always. It arrived in mailboxes on a Tuesday, which is when Loretta did her most aggressive work. The letter described Garrett's ongoing regulatory complaints as holding the community hostage to federal overreach, and warned that agency involvement could result in significant fines that would inevitably impact dues for every resident. This was technically not false. It was, however, a masterclass in omission, failing to mention that the fines existed because of an unpermitted fill that she had authorized, using a contractor she was related to, through a process that violated the community's own governing documents. Brenda had a correction email in the same distribution list within 40 minutes. 12-point Times New Roman. 3 sources cited. Brenda does not use bold text for emphasis. She doesn't need to. The letter's credibility did not survive the afternoon. Loretta's second move was more personal. Through what I can only describe as an ambitious use of the county code enforcement system, an anonymous tip was filed claiming that my cedar chip walking path, the one I had rebuilt along the restored wetland edge, constituted an unpermitted structure requiring inspection. The inspector arrived on a Wednesday. He was a young man, professional, clearly hoping for something more substantive than what he found. He looked at a mulch garden path with wooden steps. He looked at me. He filed the complaint as unsubstantiated and was back in his truck in 11 minutes. I thanked him for his time. He said, "Have a good day." We both understood what had just happened. The third move targeted Phil Osterhaus directly. Loretta approached Phil privately, at the mailbox apparently, because subtlety had never been her strong suit, and suggested that if he stopped complicating the board situation, she could ensure his re-election went smoothly. Uncontested, even. Phil Osterhaus is a man who once crawled through 14 inches of attic clearance in July to fix a neighbor's insulation rather than charge them for a contractor. He is not motivated by board re-election. He went home and wrote down the conversation in his notebook. Exact words, date, time, location. Signed it, dated it. It went into Binder 2. Loretta's fourth and most reckless move. Her attorney reached out to Clifton Marsh's office with what was framed as a settlement inquiry. The HOA would compensate me for any documented property damage. The regulatory complaints, it was suggested, might then become unnecessary. Clifton's response letter was 3 paragraphs, cordial in tone, devastating in content. It characterized the communication as an attempt to interfere with an active federal regulatory proceeding, noted that such interference carried its own legal exposure, and advised that any future contact be directed through proper legal channels. He CC'd me. I read it twice and felt the particular calm of a man who has stopped worrying about whether he's going to win. Loretta, undeterred, hired a PR consultant, an actual PR consultant, for a neighborhood HOA dispute, and scheduled a community town hall. Her own event, separate from the mandatory annual meeting, designed to get her narrative in front of residents before the annual meeting could happen. I attended. 3rd row, yellow legal pad, 1 pen. She presented for 40 minutes, charts about community amenity improvements, a timeline that somehow omitted the Army Corps complaint, the reserve fund shortfall, and the family contractor relationship. A slide, an actual PowerPoint slide, showing the connectivity path as a community benefit. The path at this point had 11 inches of standing water at the midpoint. Gerald Jr. had been photographed there 6 times in the past 2 weeks. The photo had 4,000 views on a neighborhood Facebook group. When she opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand. Loretta, could you show us the Army Corps permit for the path? Silence. The particular silence of a room waiting. Our counsel is reviewing the regulatory question, she said. I wrote something on the legal pad, folded it, put it in my breast pocket. On the way out, Tomas Elkin fell into step beside me. 6 weeks, I said, before he could ask. He nodded, wrote something in his notebook. The annual meeting was 6 weeks away. Everything Loretta had done in the past month had added weight to one side of the scale. She just didn't know yet which side she was standing on. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Joint Enforcement Correspondence. Army Corps of Engineers, Raleigh District, and the NC Division of Water Resources, jointly addressed to Pinecrest Landing Homeowners Association, and to Loretta Vance, individually, as the signatory on the construction authorization. I had a copy by Friday morning. The letter was 7 pages. Federal documents are not known for their narrative excitement, but this one had passages that I read aloud to Clifton over the phone, slowly, because some things deserved to be savored. It confirmed jurisdictional wetland status at the Phil site. It ordered immediate cessation of any further ground disturbance. It required submission of a restoration plan within 45 days. And it stated, in the measured, bureaucratic language of an agency that has seen everything and is still, technically, surprised by this, that penalties for unpermitted fill under the Clean Water Act accrue at a rate of up to $25,000 per day from the date of the fill. The fill had occurred 63 days prior. Even at a fraction of the maximum rate, the exposure was existential for an HOA with $67,000 in reserve. Loretta's personal attorney called Clifton that afternoon. The conversation, as Clifton relayed it to me, was brief. The attorney asked about the possibility of a negotiated resolution. Clifton said there were paths forward, but that they required full cooperation with the agencies, complete financial disclosure, and acknowledgement of the C&R violations. The attorney said he would convey that to his client. He did not sound optimistic. Meanwhile, outside, the marsh continued its quiet prosecution. The center depression of the path now held 11 inches of standing water year-round. Cattails along the edges had reached 2 feet. The wood duck pair, Gerald Jr. and his companion, whom Lily, my 8-year-old granddaughter, had named Duchess, were permanent residents. A neighbor on the north side of the community posted a 40-second video of Duchess paddling serenely down what was supposed to be a paved golf cart shortcut. The caption, "HOA built a duck pond by accident." 6,000 views in 3 days. Someone commented, "Nature said no." 240 likes. Loretta's attorney sent a cease and desist letter to the neighbor who posted the video. The neighbor, a retired telecommunications engineer named Douglas, who had received 4 HOA violations in 3 years for a native plant garden, posted the cease and desist letter as a follow-up comment. 9,000 views. At this point, 3 weeks before the annual meeting, the board fractured completely. Craig Dempsey and Renata Fuqua submitted a formal written request for a special board session to review the enforcement letter and the financial audit findings. Under the NC Planned Community Act, a majority of board members can convene a special meeting without presidential approval. They had 3 of 5 votes. Loretta refused to attend. She sent an email citing ongoing legal consultation. At the special meeting, held in Craig Dempsey's living room, which fit all 5 board members and exactly 0 goldenrod newsletters, Craig was appointed acting board president, pending the annual meeting election. The board formally voted to engage an independent CPA to conduct a full financial audit of HOA accounts for the preceding 3 years. The CPA was Howard. The same Howard who had done the preliminary review. He already had the files. He started Monday morning. Loretta sent one more community letter after the special meeting. It was the last one, a single-page, goldenrod paper, stating that she remained committed to the community's best interests, and that the recent procedural disagreements would be resolved through proper channels. The tone was different, quieter. The confidence that had characterized every previous communication, the patient condescension, the implication that she was the only adult in the room, was gone. What remained read like a woman who had done the math and was beginning to understand the answer. I read it at the kitchen table with my morning coffee, set it down, looked out the back window. Gerald, the original, the heron, 15 years on that marsh, was standing at the edge of the path's subsidence depression, still as a post, hunting. The path had been built to shortcut across his territory. The path was now his pond. I thought about something Clifton had said early on, in our first real meeting. The law moves slowly. Nature doesn't wait. 3 weeks to the annual meeting. Everything was in place. The Pinecrest Landing Community Room holds 120 people. On the night of the annual meeting, 147 showed up. Folding chairs were borrowed from the pool house. People stood along the back wall. The room smelled of burnt coffee and something close to anticipation, the particular energy of a community that has been quiet for too long and has finally decided to stop being quiet. Tomas Elkin was in the back corner with a notebook and a photographer. I had told him the meeting was public. I had not told him what was going to happen. He was a good enough journalist to have figured most of it out himself. I arrived early. Blue button-down, the binder, and a manila folder with 6 key documents tabbed and ready. I sat in the front row. I have never, in 19 years of attending HOA meetings, sat in the front row. Loretta was in the second row, left side, with her personal attorney beside her. She was composed, the composure of someone who has prepared for a fight and is not yet sure how outgunned she is. Acting President Craig Dempsey opened the meeting at 7 p.m. He thanked everyone for attending. He acknowledged the unprecedented turnout. Then he turned the floor over to Howard, the CPA, for the financial audit presentation. Howard is a soft-spoken man, the kind of man who delivers catastrophic information in a tone usually reserved for weather reports. He walked through 3 years of HOA financials in 22 minutes. He identified $183,000 in Vance & Sons payments. He flagged $47,000 in line items with no corresponding work documentation. He confirmed the reserve fund shortfall at $273,000 below target. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear a folding chair shift 4 rows back. Howard concluded, "In my professional opinion, the financial records of this association reflect irregularities that warrant further investigation by appropriate authorities." He sat down. Craig nodded. "Thank you, Howard." Then Clifton Marsh stood up. Clifton is not a dramatic man by nature. He is precise. He speaks the way good legal documents are written. No wasted words, no ambiguity. No exits. He read the Joint Army Corps and NCDENR enforcement letter aloud. the jurisdictional determination, the restoration order, the penalty structure. He paused at the penalty language. At the maximum rate of $25,000 per day, he said, from the date of first fill activity to this evening, the potential penalty exposure is approximately $1.5 million. He looked up. The HOA's current reserve fund balance is $67,000. Someone in the back said something quiet and emphatic. Nobody shushed them. It was, under the circumstances, an entirely reasonable response. Then I stood up. I had thought about what to say. I had written notes, crossed them out, started over. In the end, I didn't use any of them. Some things are simpler said plainly. I held up the email, the one from 8 months before construction. Wayne says he can do the whole path for under $15,000 if we keep it off the regular bid process. I'll run it as a maintenance item. I read it aloud. I set it down, picked up the delineation report, my delineation report, the one I had filed with the HOA 8 months before the dozer arrived. I held them both up, side by side. She had this, I said. She had the delineation report in her files when she wrote that email. She knew this was protected wetland. She proceeded anyway. I sat down. The room held its silence for 4 full seconds. In a room of 147 people, 4 seconds is a long time. Then Phil Osterhaus raised his hand and moved to remove Loretta Vance from the board of directors, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the Secretary of State investigation and the financial audit referral to the NC Attorney General's office. The vote was 41-6. Loretta's attorney put a hand on her arm. She didn't move for a moment. Then she gathered her folder, stood, and walked out through the side door. Her attorney followed. The door closed behind them with a sound that, in the silence of that room, was the loudest thing I had heard all evening. Tomas Elkin was writing. The photographer was shooting. Outside, in the dark behind the community building, the path that was supposed to be a shortcut sat under 11 inches of still water. Gerald Jr. and Duchess were somewhere out there in the cattails, indifferent to board politics and entirely at home. The marsh had outlasted the meeting. It always does. The cleanup took 8 months. The justice took about the same. The Army Corps and NCDENR negotiated a consent agreement with the new HOA board. No maximum penalties. In exchange for full cooperation, complete financial disclosure, and funded wetland restoration. Vance & Sons, specifically Wayne, was required to perform the restoration work at no additional charge as part of the settlement, under Army Corps supervision, with weekly compliance reporting. I want to be honest, watching Wayne Vance remove fill material from a wetland his company had illegally placed there, under the watchful eye of a federal inspector, while Gerald the Heron stood 12 feet away and observed with complete indifference, that was a very good morning. Loretta's civil case settled in February. Breach of fiduciary duty. She repaid $34,000 from personal funds. She resigned all board positions and agreed to a 3-year bar from serving on any HOA board in North Carolina. Her attorney negotiated hard on that last point. Clifton held firm. The NC Secretary of State's investigation remained open. The Attorney General referral was under review. I won't speculate on where those end. The record speaks clearly enough on its own. Craig Dempsey was elected board president at the annual meeting, uncontested. Renata Fuqua was re-elected. Phil Osterhaus, who has genuinely never wanted to be on the board, agreed to serve 1 more term because that is the kind of man Phil is. The reserve fund shortfall is being addressed through a multi-year remediation plan, modest dues increases, deferred non-critical projects, and the recovery of settlement funds. Howard the CPA is serving as a financial oversight consultant for 2 years. The goldenrod newsletters are gone. The new ones are white. They contain only factual information. The restoration work finished in late March. Soft-stem bulrush, blue flag iris, common cattail, native rush species. Planted in early spring under Army Corps supervision, watered by 2 weeks of April rain that arrived as if scheduled. Within 60 days, the delineation markers were submerged again. Within 90 days, the first red-winged blackbird had returned and established territory in the new cattail growth, singing from the top of a stem like he had never left. Gerald Jr. and Duchess nested in the restored zone. In June, there were ducklings. Lily named all 6 of them. In partnership with the Triangle Land Conservancy, the new HOA board voted unanimously to place the 1.8-acre wetland buffer under a permanent conservation easement. It cannot be developed, filled, or altered by any future owner or any future board in perpetuity. The easement is recorded with the county. It will outlast every person in this story. The dedication ceremony was held in September, 1 year after the dozer. 60 neighbors came. Lily, who is 8 years old and apparently does not experience stage fright, gave a 2-sentence speech. Wetlands clean our water and give animals a home. We should protect them. Standing ovation. 60 people. Warm September evening, standing in a field next to a marsh that had fought back and won. The HOA also established the Pinecrest Community Stewardship Scholarship, $1,500 annually, awarded to a Pinecrest Landing residence child pursuing a degree in environmental science, land management, or civil engineering. Funded by the recovered settlement money, Loretta's money, redirected toward the future she tried to pave over. The first recipient is a 17-year-old named Marcus, who wants to study wetland hydrology at NC State. He found out about the scholarship because his mother was in Brenda's phone tree. He came to the dedication ceremony and stood at the edge of the restored marsh for a long time, not saying anything. I know that feeling. I go out there most mornings now. Coffee, cedar path, wooden steps. The new ones. My grandkids helped build them. Gerald hunts the shallows. The blackbirds argue in the cattails. The water reflects whatever sky is overhead. It's the best part of the property. Still.
So here's how it ended. Remediation agreement signed, the punitive assessment board. Darling resigned mid-meeting, walked out the side door without a word. The state investigation ordered $14,000 back into the HOA's account. New board elected, transparent financials, public records photo, no password required. And that by strip of red clay, the land his grandfather broke his back on became a native playing garden, open to the neighborhood on Garrett's terms, his schedule, his gate. Not bad for 19 lines of boilerplate nobody bothered to read. Here's what I keep coming right to. Darlene had lawyers. She had votes. She had a petition with 71 signatures, and every institutional level a small town HOA president could pull. Garrett had one document and the patience to understand it. She bet on him being too frustrated to think straight, too emotional to prepare, too tired to fight back. She was wrong on all three. The most dangerous person in any dispute isn't the loudest one. It's the one who already read the documents before the meeting started and said nothing until the right moment. So if you got an HOA breathing down your neck right now, pull your deed, read your easement, find the page 14, because somewhere in that boilerplate might be the one sentence that changes everything. And if you live through your own version of this, your own darling, your own black hole, your own moment where someone with a clipboard decided your property was theirs, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.